Chapter 3. The day I boarded the royal skyship Lumina at dawn, the harbor looked as if the night had lied. The broken promenade in the lower square was still sealed behind silvered barrier cloth, the eastern approach still crawling with repair crews, and the emergency lamps still hung where the route markers had failed. Yet the sky itself had turned so clean and pale above Violia that anyone seeing it for the first time might have thought nothing bad had ever happened here. Thin morning light washed the islands in pearl and gold. The glass roofs of the upper galleries caught fire at the edges. Far below, the lowest cargo chains flashed briefly like wet thread. I stood on the royal departure terrace with my travel satchel in one hand, my tool case in the other, and the lacquered crown box tucked under my arm again, because apparently once a thing enters your life through panic and falling, it never leaves in an orderly way. The terrace jutted from the eastern wing of the palace harbor, higher than any work platform I had stood on in my life. From there I could see the workshop quarter in tiers below, its chimneys just beginning to smoke, its narrow hanging bridges catching early sun, the awnings over dye stalls still furled. Somewhere in that honey-colored patchwork of roofs, Master Ilara would be opening the shutters of the shop with her usual muttering, pretending to be furious with me instead of worried. She had done both, in that order, when the palace carriage had brought me back to the workshop after midnight. I had not expected Julian to keep his word about that. Or rather, I had expected him to keep it and the palace to make it difficult. Instead, an attendant had escorted me under royal seal, a guard had remained politely in the lane while I packed tools, spare ribbon, oil vials, and 3 changes of working clothes, and Master Ilara had stared at the palace mark on the carriage door for a full 10 seconds before seizing me by both shoulders and demanding to know whether I had secretly committed treason. Not on purpose, I had said. That had been the wrong answer. She had made me sit, shoved tea into my hands, and listened with the tight-lipped stillness she used when trying not to interrupt me into death. She did interrupt me into death 3 times anyway, once at the Crown Prince caught the crown, once at the route marker exploded, and once at I may need my heavier pliers because I am leaving on a royal skyship at dawn. At that, she had put her head in her hands. When I told her I had the option to refuse, she had looked up sharply. And I have not refused. Because I had stared at the worn grooves in the workshop table and the scatter of powdered petals still clinging to the grain. The place smelled of resin and rosemary oil and the faint sweet rot of stems trimmed too late. Ordinary smells. Safe smells. The kind that should have made the choice simpler. It concerns the routes, I had said at last. Not only the palace. The western lines too. Master Ilara's mouth had tightened. That was all. No speech about duty, no order to go, no plea to stay. She knew as well as I did what unstable routes did to lower districts. She had lived long enough to see shortages walk in smiling and leave families hungry. And the prince? She had asked after a moment too quiet to be casual. I had been tired enough to answer honestly, which was reckless. He asked as if I were a person. That had earned me one very long look. Well, she had said finally. How disastrous. Then she had turned away to pull my older traveling cloak from a storage chest and begun packing for me as if she had known from the first breath what I would choose. Now, standing on the royal terrace in the thin cold of morning, I thought of her hands folding my clothes with more force than strictly necessary, of the way she had slipped my mother's small brass scissors into the side pocket of my tool roll without comment, of the final thing she had said as the guard waited outside and dawn threatened the windows. If they treat you like a thing, come home. She had not needed to specify whom she meant by they. So I stood on the departure terrace and looked down over the city that had shaped every practical thought in my head, and for the first time since agreeing, the size of what I had done began to settle properly in my bones. I was leaving the capital aboard the royal skyship, not as hired staff, not as a servant, not as decoration for some noble excursion, because the crown I had made answered the stars wrongly or rightly, which was perhaps worse, and because the Crown Prince himself had asked me to come and promised I could still say no even after yes had changed the air between us. I wished he had been less difficult to trust. The terrace was already busy. Servants moved between supply stacks and the loading cranes in soft-soled shoes that made almost no sound on the white stone. 2 clerks checked sealed route packets against waxed manifests. Palace guards stood at measured intervals with the kind of stillness that made them seem ornamental until you noticed how every gaze tracked movement. A line of luggage cases, all polished brass corners and restrained royal markings, sat waiting by the boarding bridge. Mine looked like a stubborn workshop accident beside them. A low metallic hum sounded somewhere beyond the terrace towers. I lifted my head. The Lumina emerged from behind the eastern harbor spire like a thought too extravagant to belong to ordinary people. I had seen royal vessels before, from below and at a distance, their light sails gliding above the city at festival processions or state departures. That was not the same thing as seeing one approach at eye level through the morning sky. The ship was long and graceful without being delicate, built on a narrow luminous hull whose sides caught the dawn in soft silver blue. 3 main fins curved back from the stern like layered wings of beaten pearl. The sail arrays were furled for approach, leaving only the slender light frame ribs visible, each threaded with faint gleaming lines that looked less engineered than woven. Along the undercarriage ran the stabilizing vanes, finer than those on merchant craft and set with a pattern of starstone sockets that pulsed dimly as the ship rode the route current in. The prow narrowed to a clean blade-like point beneath a carved crest worked in old silver. Even before I could make out the design, the sight of it tugged somewhere I did not expect. The ship did not descend like other ships. Most harbor craft announced themselves with winch groans and ballast shifts and the practical clatter of crew correcting for wind. The Lumina moved in near silence, its starstone core murmuring under the hull with the low, almost musical note high-quality engines made when perfectly tuned. The route line beneath it did not merely guide. It answered. The silver thread in the air thickened under the prow as if the ship were being welcomed home. "Beautiful, isn't she?" I turned. Felix Norwood stood 2 paces behind me with a slate tucked under one arm, a roll of route charts under the other, and his hair tied back this morning with all the care of a man who had lost an argument with a comb but refused to let society know. He had changed from scholar's blue into a fitted travel coat with reinforced cuffs and hidden pockets down the side seams. The effect should have made him look more serious. It did not. "It looks expensive," I said. "That too." He came to the railing and followed my gaze. "Though if Marcus hears you say the hull is pretty before you praise the sail structure, he may decide you are beyond education." "Marcus?" "The captain." As if summoned by disapproval alone, a man stepped onto the upper boarding platform from the ship's side gangway. Captain Marcus Hale looked as though he had been carved out of something less forgiving than flesh and given just enough patience to function among other people. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and dressed in the dark-fitted command coat of the Royal Air Fleet, the silver cord at one shoulder pinned back with functional neatness rather than display. His face might have been called handsome if it had not been so determined to be stern. A pale scar ran from just under one ear into the collar line and vanished there. He moved like a man whose body had long since decided that hesitation was for other professions. His eyes found Felix first, then me. I had never met a person who could make the phrase "I see there is an additional complication" land without speaking. Felix, cheerful fool that he was, lifted a hand. "Good morning, Captain." Marcus descended the platform steps with measured efficiency. "Master Norwood." His gaze shifted to me again. "Not rude. Worse. Appraising. Miss Belrose." I tried not to stand straighter under it and failed. "Captain, you travel light," he said, looking at my 2 satchels and the crown box. I was under the impression we were investigating route anomalies, not opening a second shop. Felix made a choking sort of sound that may have been the beginning of a laugh. Marcus did not smile. That depends on what else your craft does, he said. The words were level. No accusation in them. No welcome either. I looked at the ship instead of at him. Do you often greet passengers by implying they are suspicious? I rarely imply. That, infuriatingly, was a better answer than the line deserved. Felix slid into the silence before I could decide whether to be offended or amused. Marcus, please do not frighten away the only person on this expedition whose handiwork appears capable of waking half the western route net. I am not frightening her. No, I said. You are trying very hard to let me frighten myself. Marcus considered that. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting the angle at which he viewed me. Then perhaps you will save us time. Before I could answer, a stir ran through the terrace. Julian had arrived. That should not have changed the air as much as it did. No herald announced him. No trumpets thank the stars. He crossed the terrace from the inner hall with only one attendant at his back and a guard captain several paces behind, dressed for travel rather than court. The formal midnight coat from the harbor was gone. In its place he wore a fitted dark naval jacket braided lightly at the cuffs, high boots, and a short travel cloak pinned with a silver clasp at one shoulder. The change should have made him seem less princely. It did not. If anything, stripped of court polish, he looked more like what the upper city was always trying to convince the rest of us its rulers were: capable, calm, impossibly composed. Then he came near enough for me to see the bandage still hidden beneath his left sleeve and the shadows under his eyes from a night that had not left much room for sleep. That helped. His gaze found me at once, and whatever else he had been carrying seemed to ease by a degree. It was a small thing. I noticed it anyway. "Good morning," he said. There are greetings that belong in ordinary mouths and greetings that sound like attention when certain people speak them. This one was the second kind, entirely unfair. "Your Highness," I said. His eyes flicked to the satchel at my feet, the tool case in my hand, the travel cloak Master Alara had bullied into respectable neatness. "You came. You arranged a ship," I said. It would have been rude to waste the effort. Warmth touched his mouth. Marcus, who clearly regarded warmth as a structural weakness in vessels and people alike, said, "The harbor route window is narrowing. If we are to depart on the west line before the route traffic thickens, we should board now." Julian inclined his head. Of course. He might have said more to me. I felt, absurdly, that he might have wanted to. But there were clerks with route packets, a quartermaster waiting with supply tallies, and whatever private pain the route disturbances were still pressing into his body. He let duty take him, as he always seemed ready to do, and went toward Marcus and the manifests. Felix leaned in under the cover of their shift away from us. "He looks terrible." I almost told him that was a treasonous thing to say within palace walls. Then I remembered who he was. "He looks upright," I said. "That is not the same," Felix muttered. No, it was not. A pair of ship attendants came for the luggage cases. One tried to take my tool satchel. I kept hold of it. "It contains blades," I said. The attendant looked alarmed. "Miss Belrose, they are floral blades." That did not help. Julian, overhearing from several paces away, turned his head slightly. "Let her keep it." The attendant bowed at once and retreated. Marcus looked as if he had opinions on the palace's recent surrender to improvised workshop exceptions. He kept them to himself. I was beginning to suspect silence was how he expressed his most cutting judgments. The boarding bridge extended with a smooth mechanical slide from the terrace to the ship's side lock. The Lumina settled the last few feet into place with a long low hum from the hull core. Up close, the ship smelled of polished wood, cold metal, oil, and the faint mineral brightness of active starstone. Not merchant craft smells, exactly. Cleaner, more disciplined. The sort of vessel where someone probably knew when a hinge had fallen out of alignment by the sound it made 2 corridors away. I stopped at the threshold anyway. From here the height mattered more. The bridge was enclosed by waist-high silver rails and a veil screen of protective lattice, but the sky beyond still opened in impossible blue-white distance. Below the bridge, the city fell away in layers. Palace terraces, market roofs, workshop lines, cargo cranes, and beneath them all the deep lower drop where cloud shadow drifted like torn fabric. It was one thing to look down from a terrace with both feet on stone, another to step onto a bridge leading into open air. Julian noticed. He had already crossed half the span with Marcus when he turned back. Not dramatically, just enough to see me still standing where palace stone ended and ship began. "You need not hurry," he said. I hated how quickly the knot in my chest loosened at that. "Everyone else seems to be," I said. "The Lumina can survive one delayed step." Marcus, from further ahead, said, "The bridge can. The schedule may not." Felix muttered, "He says charming things when anxious." "I heard that," Marcus said. "Excellent." That nearly made me smile. Nearly. I looked once more over the rail to the workshop quarter far below. Morning had advanced just enough to put warm light on the row of hanging gardens near our lane. From here they were only tiny blocks of green and flower color caught among roofs and work chimneys. Somewhere in that small patch of the city, my old life was starting its ordinary day without me. A ridiculous thought came and stuck. I might not come back the same. Not grandly changed. Not turned into some palace creature or rout prophet or other terrible thing people like to make of girls pulled above their station. More quietly than that. I might return having seen distances my hands had only ever worked to serve. I might know too much about what kept the kingdom hanging together. I might have looked too long at a prince who treated me as if my choices mattered and find afterward that ordinary men had become impossible to bear. That last thought I pushed away so hard it nearly took my balance with it. I stepped onto the bridge. The rail was cool under my glove. The structure barely trembled beneath my boots, built better than most palace stairs and half the freight walkways in the lower harbor. Even so, I felt every pace through my knees. Julian waited without making the waiting visible. He resumed walking only once I had crossed far enough not to feel watched over in the way that makes one want to argue. It was another small precise kindness, the sort he seemed incapable of giving carelessly. That was becoming a problem. The side lock opened into the main receiving passage of the Lumina, and for a moment I forgot my own feet. The interior was not lavish in the cluttered palace sense. No pointless gilding, no chandeliers trying too hard to prove importance. It was beautiful because it had been built with confidence. The walls curved in pale wood and silver-braced ribbing, the grain polished until it looked like light trapped underwater. Narrow crystal panes ran along the upper hull line, throwing sunlit route reflections over the floor in shifting silver patterns. The passage floor itself was dark, smooth deckwood inset with thin guidance lines of old star metal that hummed faintly underfoot when the ship's core turned. Brass fixtures held steady against the curves of the walls. The air felt cooler than on the terrace, touched by the clean draft of circulating route vents. It did not feel like a floating palace. It felt like a ship someone loved. I think Marcus heard the silence in me, because he looked back once and said, "Do not lean against the interior ribs unless you enjoy being rattled when the sails open." That was almost friendly by his standards. Or perhaps I was becoming delusional. Felix moved ahead of me, talking as he walked, which I suspected was how he crossed all distances. The luminous hull was rebuilt twice in the last 40 years, but the underframe is older than that. Route-responsive reinforcement lines along the spine, triple starstone chamber, auxiliary windgill beneath the stern. See the floor metal? That is original threading. Threading, I repeated, because the word hooked me before the rest did. He looked delighted by my interest, which may have been because most sane people fled when he began describing structural design before breakfast. The old builders used a woven terminology for half their support systems. Route lines, current braids, anchor knots, sail skeins. Everyone modern pretends this is metaphor because it embarrasses the engineers. It is much more interesting if it is not. The word interesting on Felix meant dangerous, forgotten, or likely to involve climbing somewhere one had been warned not to climb. Attendants guided me to a small cabin along the portside middle deck. It was far finer than anything I would have rented for myself and far plainer than palace guest rooms, which suited me perfectly. Narrow bed fixed to the wall, one polished chest, one washstand with strapped basin, a round crystal port window showing the harbor light, and beneath it a small fold-out work shelf with clamps at the corners. I stopped there. You put a work shelf in a guest cabin? The attendant smiled. His Highness requested that one be secured for you. Of course he had. That should have pleased me. Instead it made something ache unexpectedly in my chest. To be thought of so particularly by someone who had no reason to know how my mind worked was far too dangerous this early in a journey. The attendant left. I set down the tool satchel and ran my fingers over the clamps. Sturdy, useful, real, not decorative nonsense. My mother's brass scissors glinted when I unrolled the side pocket. The sight steadied me in a way the palace never had. A soft knock came not half a minute later. I opened the door to Julian. He stood in the narrow passage with no attendant behind him and a folded route packet in one hand. In the close ship light, the weariness in him showed more plainly than on the terrace. Not because he had lost composure, because on a ship, in a corridor meant for working movement rather than court display, there was less distance to hide behind. I hope the cabin is acceptable, he said. Acceptable. As if he had put me in a room better than most high merchants' travel suites and expected me to grade it against a private palace wing. It has a work table, I said. His gaze flicked past me, landing briefly on the fold-out shelf. Then I guessed correctly. That is inconvenient of you. He looked at me, and for one suspended second I thought he might ask what I meant. Instead, something warmer than amusement, softer than triumph, touched his face. I have been told that before, he said. There was no safe reply to that, so I moved aside. Did you come to inspect whether I had fled through the porthole? The thought had crossed my mind. The glass is too small. I am relieved. He did not enter fully, only stepped just enough into the doorway to keep the passage clear. The route packet in his hand bore the royal seal broken open already. Marcus wants the first day's schedule in everyone's hands before departure, he said. He believes uncertainty breeds disorder. And does it? On shifts? Often. He held out the packet. I took it and found more papers inside than any sane voyage required: departure timing, probable western approach lanes, provisions schedule, weather estimates, emergency bell codes, even a short diagram of the main deck and station ladders. No one in the lower harbor would have survived Marcus's rule without developing either discipline or a drinking problem. I assume this is the captain's influence, I said. Entirely. I glanced up. And yours? My influence was limited to insisting no one overwhelm you with 6 different explanations before breakfast. That was thoughtful. I thought so too. Marcus said it coddled. I nearly smiled again. He leaned one shoulder lightly against the door frame, and only then did I notice the slight carefulness in the motion. He hid pain better when watched broadly, less well in close quarters. What does the strain feel like? I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes lifted to mine. No courtroom now. No minister listening. Just the ship corridor, soft hull hum underfoot, morning light shifting through the round window behind me. He took a breath. Like hearing a note held badly, he said at last. Not with the ear. In the bones, perhaps. Small route fluctuations are only discomfort. When a major line twists or breaks, he searched for words and failed them slightly. That alone told me how unusual his honesty was here. It becomes difficult to tell where my own balance ends. I had expected metaphor. I had not expected vulnerability. And last night? A great deal of bad music. I let out a short surprised laugh before I could help it. He smiled, and for one stupid heartbeat the narrow cabin seemed too small for the shift that made in my chest. That sounds less dignified than what you told the physician, I said. It is also more accurate. I looked down at the route packet because the alternative was to keep meeting that expression and make a fool of myself before sunrise had fully committed to morning. If it becomes worse out there, I said, you will tell someone. A pause. I am telling you now. That was not the same promise. Perhaps he knew it. Perhaps I did. Neither of us said so. Voices sounded further up the passage. A crewman calling sail readiness. Another answering from the stairwell. Duty found him again, swift and inevitable. We depart in 10 minutes, he said. Once we clear the capital ring, Marcus will give a full ship briefing on the observation deck. All right. He hesitated. Very slightly. And Cora? I looked up. If at any point the ship unsettles you, say so. The first climb into open distance is often worse than people expect. There it was again. Not command. Care shaped into practical permission. I folded the packet against my palm. I grew up over cargo voids. You also grew up with stone under most of your steps. That is annoyingly true. It often is. He left then, taking the corridor light with him in a way that should have been impossible and was not. I shut the door, leaned back against it for one reckless second, and glared at the ceiling as if the ship itself might explain why a man could be so polite and still be dangerous to my peace. Then the departure bell rang. The sound moved through the lumina not as a harsh clang but as a layered tone carried along the star metal lines under the floor. One clear note, then a lower answering pulse from the hull core. It made the air seem to gather itself. I stowed my satchel under the bed, strapped the crown box into the wall bracket the attendant had thoughtfully left open, and went back into the corridor before I could lose my nerve. The observation deck lay along the forward upper level, open to the sky behind a high protective screen of reinforced crystal lattice. By the time I reached it, Felix was already there with route maps pinned under 2 brass clips. Marcus stood near the helm stair speaking to a crew lieutenant, and Julian was at the prow side rail looking toward the route towers ahead. Several crew members moved between stations with the smooth efficiency of people who no longer noticed they were balancing over open air. Then the outer mooring clamps released. No matter how fine a ship is, there is always a moment when the body knows it is no longer attached to the world it trusts. The terrace slid away in slow, perfect silence. Not dropped, not left abruptly. The lumina eased backward from the palace lock on stabilizer drift, Starstone core humming deeper now, until the ship hung free over the morning sky. The city opened beneath us all at once. My hand closed around the rail. Violia spread below like 100 bright thoughts suspended over the abyss. The upper island shone white and gold around the palace crest. The middle levels stepped down in hanging gardens, bridges, workshops, market spans, conservatories with glass domes flashing in the sun. Below that the harbor belts widened into cranes, dock arms, cargo lifts, loading lanes, and the patched, lived-in architecture of the working islands. Beyond the capital ring floated the outer chain, smaller islands strung along the western route like beads dropped in air, each with its own glimmer of habitation and tower light. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It made my ribs feel too small. Marcus noticed everything. Breathe, Miss Belrose. I am. Do it better. Felix murmured. That is one of his kinder coaching methods. I shot him a look. The city dropped away another measure as the lumina turned into the west departure lane, and my stomach made a strong case for remaining in bed forever. Julian came to the rail beside me without crowding it. Pick one point, he said quietly. Do not try to hold the whole view at once. I looked at him. The West Clock Tower, he said, nodding toward a tall silver-roofed tower 3 islands out. Follow only that until your balance catches up. I did. The tower stayed steady while the rest of the city moved around it. Then the next route mast. Then a bridge. Then the broad copper roof of the Western Conservatory. Slowly the ship's motion stopped feeling like the world abandoning its habits and started feeling like a different kind of ground. When I looked back at him, he had not been watching the city at all. He had been watching me. That helped, I admitted. I am glad. Marcus stepped to the central chart stand. Attention. The crew gathered by reflex. Felix stopped fidgeting with the maps. Even the wind seemed to shift around the captain's voice. We follow the west chain by Primary Dayline to Glassmere Junction, he said. Anomaly packet lists route drift reports at 3 points beyond the capital ring, most severe near the western trade lane and the first relay marker before Marrow Reach. We do not chase rumors. We verify active faults. We do not deter for spectacle, salvage, private deliveries, or scholar curiosity. Felix looked wounded. That seems pointed. It is. Marcus continued as if neither of us had spoken. Miss Belrose remains under no formal command except in shipboard safety. If I tell you to get below deck, you get below deck. If I tell you to hold a rail, you hold it. If the prince tells you otherwise, ignore him unless he outranks the storm. Julian's mouth twitched. Does he? Felix asked. Marcus gave him a flat look. Not yet. That won a soft, rough laugh from 2 nearby crewmen, which told me the captain's severity had limits if one lived on the ship long enough to map them. He then explained the star lamp system, which I would have understood anyway from harbor work, though the Luminous was finer than any merchant craft I knew. The starstone core sat low in the central spine and fed current through route-responsive lines along the hull. 3 main star lamps, one at the prow, one at the stern, and one within the dorsal marker housing caught the visible night routes most strongly, but day sailing still relied on their resonance with the dormant route structure in the sky. Stabilizer vanes adjusted to windstream and route pull together. If one failed, the ship could limp on the other, but not gracefully. Emergency hand anchors could be dropped on short tether lines near mooring spires or solid outcroppings, though no captain with sense relied on them in a live storm. Why light sails if the route lines do most of the carrying? I asked. Marcus glanced at me, and this time the glance held less suspicion than assessment of whether I would understand the answer. Because the routes guide. They do not forgive. Sail control lets us take the windstream without overloading the starstone chamber, correct drift when the line warps, and survive when the old systems behave like old systems. Temperamentally, I said. Obstinately, Felix added, and because ancient engineers had the decency not to assume the sky would always cooperate. Marcus did not disagree. That, from him, felt almost revolutionary. By the time the briefing ended, the capital ring had fallen behind us and the western chain opened ahead in long blue distance. Daylight made the ancient route lines faint, almost invisible, but if I narrowed my gaze I could still sometimes catch them, pale arcs lying under the sky like scratches beneath glaze. The wind freshened. Sail crews moved to the upper frames. At Marcus's signal, the luminous light sails unfurled. I had seen sails open from below. I had never heard the sound from within the ship. The ribs extended first with a soft cascading click, each joint locking outward in sequence along the port and starboard frames. Then the woven light cloth spilled between them, nearly transparent at first, like mist being taught a shape. As the starstone current caught, the sails filled not only with wind but with a pearled inner radiance, turning the whole vessel into something between craft and constellation. The deck shivered once under the new strain. The hull note deepened. We surged forward. The city dropped farther behind. No one on deck made much of it. That steadied me more than sympathy would have. Ships moved. Crew worked. A prince took his place where needed. A scholar unrolled too many maps. A captain measured horizon and current and timing with flinty concentration. And I, flower crown apprentice from the middle workshops, stood with a royal route packet tucked under my arm and my mother's scissors in my satchel, sailing toward western faults that had already begun touching our lives long before anyone above had said their names aloud. It might have felt grand if my stomach had not still been negotiating with gravity. Morning passed in practical pieces. Felix showed me the outer route chart and the 3 anomaly points marked in red wax. One near a trade lane cross-current. One near a decommissioned relay spur. One, more troublingly, near a dead star marker station that should not have been responding to anything at all. He talked too much, but usefully, and once I got him onto structures rather than theory, his explanations had the clean, detailed pleasure of real knowledge. Marcus assigned a deckhand to familiarize me with emergency grips, lower passage shortcuts, and the difference between bells for weather shear, route drift, and immediate brace loss. I suspected this was his way of deciding whether I would be burdensome. By the end of the lesson he at least stopped looking as if I might wander into the sails out of artistic distraction. Julian vanished into ship business twice and returned each time looking a little paler around the mouth, though no one else seemed to challenge him on it. At midday he joined us in the chart alcove for a standing meal of warm bread, salted fish, sliced winter pear, and strong tea. No one at the table had the courage to pretend it was a court luncheon simply because royal hands touched the same bread. The first confirmed fault is only an hour out, Marcus said over the map. Felix tapped the marked point. Trade lane drift, mild on yesterday's packet. Worse by dawn report. If it remains localized, we may be looking at a strain pocket instead of a full route tier. If it were a full tier, several cargo ships would already be late by more than the office can politely disguise, Julian said. I looked up. Can the office politely disguise late cargo? All governing bodies prefer delays when they can still be blamed on weather, Felix said. Marcus ignored that. Miss Belrose, if your crown responds, I want warning before you touch anything. That assumes I intend to wander the deck pressing crowns onto ship parts for sport. That assumes nothing. It is instruction. Julian sipped his tea. He grows affectionate. Marcus gave him the look of a man betrayed by humor occurring near his command table. The strange ease of it unsettled me more than open tension would have. Crew passed in and out. Route charts rustled. Outside the crystal panes, the western islands drifted by in layers of pale rock, hanging gardens, and route towers. We were discussing route failure, possible ancient structures, and whether my handiwork might answer them, and yet the conversation moved with an ordinary rhythm. It made the danger feel both less immediate and more real. This was not a single accident anymore. It was work. Necessary work. The kind that could break people because they had to keep doing it while afraid. After the meal I went to my cabin to check the crown. I had avoided doing so all morning except to ensure the box remained secure. Partly from superstition, partly because some foolish part of me thought it might look ordinary again if given enough time away from princes, scholars, and royal decks. It did not. The bent spray Julian had corrected sat properly now, but the inner silver weave had changed. Not visibly to anyone else, perhaps. To my fingers, yes. The tension along the hidden crossing felt warmer, more responsive, as if the material had remembered strain and settled into a different readiness after the harbor flare. Silver does not do that. Flowers do not do that. Wishes certainly do not. I laid the crown on the work shelf and unfastened the inner binding by one careful degree, enough to test the pull under the flowers. The hidden crossing caught on my nail. A tiny pulse ran through the thread and into my finger, not pain, not light, just a shiver like a note struck very far away. I jerked back. Then I swore at myself, because if one starts leaping in fright at one's own work, a long voyage becomes impossible. I leaned in again, slower. The pattern under the flowers did not merely hold the silver. It distributed tension through the ring differently than any current workshop style. I had always known that by feel. Today I understood it with a new sharpness. The hidden cross-bind did not trap current. It guided it. Over instead of through, under instead of tight against. If one changed the angle of the turn, a knock interrupted me. This time it was Marcus. That was enough to make any woman feel momentarily guilty even when committing no crime. I straightened. "Captain?" He stood in the doorway without apology, attention falling at once to the crown on the table and my hands near the inner binding. "You were changing it, testing it. Which changes it? Only if I do more." His gaze moved from the crown to the work shelf clamps, to the brass scissors, to the pin cushion I had already unpacked. Assessing a workshop corner in 3 heartbeats. He had probably done the same to enemy decks, storm damage, compromised rigging, and men who lied under pressure. "What have you found?" I hesitated. Not because I did not want to answer. Because I was still learning what I knew. "The inner crossing distributes pull," I said slowly. "Not for sturdiness alone. It shifts how tension runs through the ring. I think that is why the flare moved so cleanly last night instead of burning one point and dying." He listened without interruption. "That means?" "That if the star lamps or route markers have anything like a comparable structure, threads, lines, braces, I do not know, then the way something is bound may change how it takes current." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, "Can you do that deliberately?" I looked at the crown, then at my own fingers. "I do not know yet." The answer seemed to satisfy him more than overconfidence would have. "Good." I blinked. "Good. People who do not know are less likely to kill my crew by guessing." There it was. His version of trust, harsh and practical and, annoyingly, not unkind. A ship bell rang overhead. 3 low notes, spaced evenly. Marcus's head turned. "Observation deck." "Now." We took the stairs up at once. The light had changed outside. Morning blue had given way to a harder white sky streaked at the western edge with a dark metallic smear that did not belong to ordinary weather. Ahead, the route line barely visible, and day flickered once, twice, like a fish flashing underwater. The luminous prow star lamp pulsed in answer. Crew were already moving into storm positions, not full engagement yet, but close. Felix stood at the chart stand with one hand on the rail and no color left in his face. "That was not in the packet." "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't." Julian was near the forward lattice, one hand braced against the support frame. He did not look back immediately. When he did, the strain in him was no longer subtle. It had sharpened his features and drawn the weariness tighter around his mouth. "The route ahead is fraying," he said. "Something is feeding on the line." Star Eater storm. The term had sounded half folkloric when spoken in workshops and market gossip. Beautiful, dangerous, the kind of thing sailors dressed up into dockside tales to make apprentices shiver. Seen from the deck, there was nothing folkloric about it. The dark smear ahead was not cloud but moving ash-silver turbulence, swallowing the pale route glimmer at the edges as it curled. Every few breaths a spark of route light vanished into it and did not return. Marcus snapped orders. "Reef the secondary light cloth. Reduce forward pull by 10. Brace port stabilizers. Keep the line but widen the angle." Crew scattered. The Lumina heeled subtly as sail tension changed. The hull hum deepened into a lower, uneasy tone. "We can cut south and lose the fault," Felix said. "We can," Marcus answered, "if you want 3 days delay and no idea what the first fault actually is." Julian's fingers tightened against the frame. "We skirt the edge." Marcus nodded once. Agreement between them moved quickly, well used. Then the prow lamp faltered. It did not go out all at once. It blinked blind, recovered, and blinked again. The deck vibrated under my boots. Somewhere beneath us a stabilizer vane screamed against windshift. The protective lattice on the observation deck flashed once with static route light and went dim. "Prow lamp losing catch." A crewman shouted. "Manual correction on line 3. Marcus barked back. Another pulse hit the ship, not impact exactly. A sucking rawness, as if the route current under us had been bitten through for half a second. The Lumina dropped one sickening pace in open air. The world lurched. I grabbed the nearest rail. Felix swore creatively. Several crew on the upper sail frame clipped safety lines on at once. The prow lamp flashed white and then dull amber, nearly blind. "Brace!" Marcus shouted. Too late. The next pull came sideways. The ship slewed toward the dark edge of the storm pocket, not enough for collision but enough to scrape us along its hunger. The air changed instantly, colder, metallic, full of a fine singing noise that made the roots of my teeth ache. Route light bled in ribbons across the deck lattice and vanished into the swirling dark. Julian went pale. Not merely tired pale. Shock pale. I saw it and understood in the same instant. The storm was not only near the route, it was chewing through something he felt inside his own body. He pushed off the frame anyway, trying to move toward the prow stair. Marcus caught his arm. "No. The lamp, you can barely stand." "I can stand enough." The ship dropped again. A crewman near the prow housing shouted. The star lamp threads burned through its outer bind. I looked. The prow star lamp sat within a silver housing just beyond the observation deck line, fixed into the forward support bracket where 3 current threads fed into a crystal core. One of the outer conductor wraps had indeed loosened under the route surge. Not snapped completely. Twisted half free, enough for current to spill wrong and the lamp to lose stable catch. There was no time to fetch workshop cord, no time to lower the housing fully, no time for careful thinking. My hands were already on the crown box. Marcus saw. "Miss Belrose, I know." No, I did not. Not completely. But I knew enough. I tore the box open, seized the crown, and for one heartbeat nearly stopped because it was a royal commission, because it had already done too much, because dismantling finished work on a ship deck in front of a captain seemed like the kind of madness that should at least wait for written permission. Then the Lumina shuddered hard enough to throw that thought overboard. I hooked my thumb under the hidden crossing and pulled. The silver inner weave came free in a long bright spill from under the flowers, not breaking because my mother's pattern had never cinched it into death. The ring sagged. White petals scattered across the deck and blew toward the protective lattice like torn wishes. Felix made a sound halfway between horror and revelation. I ran to the prow housing. 2 crewmen were already there, fighting the bucking bracket. The loosened conductor wrap spat pale sparks each time the storm edge licked at the route line under us. The lamp crystal inside pulsed weakly, catching and losing current too fast to stabilize. "There!" I shouted. "Hold it open." One of them looked to Marcus. Marcus, who had reached the stair above us with Julian just behind him, gave one clipped nod. That was all I needed. I wrapped the freed silver from the crown around the housing bind not as one mends jewelry, but as one saves a structure from remembering it is breakable. Under, across, through the loosened outer conductor, back under the brace notch, leaving tension room instead of forcing a hard lock. My fingers moved before thought could slow them. My mother's turns. My own adjustments. The thing I had been feeling on the work shelf only minutes before. The silver bit cold into my gloves. I pulled the last crossing tight. For one impossible instant, nothing happened. Then the star lamp blazed. Not gently. Not a safe, polite relighting. White route fire ran through the rewound silver and snapped into the crystal core so hard the whole housing rang. The lamp surged bright, steadied, and sent a clean spear of light into the half-devoured route ahead. The Lumina lurched back into line as if a hand had caught its jaw and turned it straight. Crew on 3 decks shouted at once. The hull hum rose from 6 strain into working pitch. The sideways pull eased. Marcus's voice cut through everything. "Hold that line. Keep her wide of the dark." The ship responded. Sails corrected. Stabilizers bit. The storm edge scraped along us one last hungry breath and slid away off the port side, leaving the observation deck awash in fading static and torn white petals from a crown that no longer existed. I stayed crouched by the prow housing because my knees had gone unreliable. The rewound silver still glowed faintly around the bind. Julian was beside me before I heard him move. "Cora, I am all right," I said automatically, though my hands were shaking so hard the remaining petals trembled against my sleeves. He looked from my face to the lamp housing, to the empty crown ring still dangling uselessly from one broken floral segment in my fist. Something like wonder and fear crossed his expression together, too quick to separate. "The bind changed it," he said softly. "Yes, that was all I had." Above us, the last black fringe of the storm pocket peeled away from the route and dissolved into ordinary cloud shadow. The air lost its metallic singing. The route line ahead faint in daylight, but there held steady. Marcus came down the final stair and looked first at the lamp, then at my hands. "Report," he said to the crewman at the housing. "Prow lamp catch restored, Captain. Outer bind improvised but stable. Current leak reduced. Route alignment returning." Marcus's gaze shifted to me. "Improvised." I rose carefully, still holding the mangled remains of what had been the royal crown. "Would you prefer decorative phrasing?" He ignored that. His attention settled on the silver rewinding, then on the pattern of the crossing where I had set it. "You did not tie it like a repairman." "No," I said. "I tied it like a crown maker." Something changed in his face then. Not much. No dramatic thaw. But the hard dismissive line he had held around me since dawn loosened by a degree. "Heavy weather men would have cinched it flat," he said. "It would have burned through," I answered. "Yes." The single word landed like the first coin paid into a long empty account. Behind him, Felix arrived breathless and half wild with discovery. "You rewove a live conductor under route load." I noticed. "No, you do not understand the scale of—" "She does," Marcus said. That shut him up more effectively than any argument. Julian still had not moved back. He stood close enough that I could feel the cold from his storm-drained skin in the air between us. His face had regained a little color now that the route line steadied, but not much. I saw his hand flex once, as if reminding itself it still belonged to him. "The storm touched the line before we reached the marker," he said to Marcus. "If it has spread this far inward, the Western reports were already old when they reached the capital." Marcus nodded. "Then our first port is worse than the packet says." Felix looked toward the west chain through the lattice. "Glassmere will have felt that." The name meant warehouses, trading berths, produce docks, route junctions. A commercial island. Busy, practical, necessary. If the route there had worsened, the people below would already be paying for it in spoiled goods and stranded ships. My pulse had not settled from the storm, yet something in me tightened into a different shape entirely. This was no longer palace fear, no longer prince and mystery and impossible light on a festival crown. This was freight lanes, market timing, lower island strain, ordinary lives pulled hard by failing routes. I looked down at the crushed flowers in my hand. The white petals had browned at the edges where current had flashed through them. Wishes ruined. Or perhaps transformed. I did not know enough yet to choose the word. Julian saw the crown remains. "I am sorry," he said. It startled me so much I almost laughed. "For the commission?" I asked. "I do not think the steward will want it now. For the choice being taken from you." The ship still hummed with the aftermath of danger. Crew were resetting sail trim. Felix was muttering over the lamp housing. Marcus was issuing revised approach orders. Yet for one breath it seemed only the two of us stood in that narrow cleared space by the prow. I opened my hand and let the dead petals rest there. "I chose when I pulled it apart," I said. His gaze held mine. "Not because I had said anything pretty. Because I had said something true." Marcus broke the moment, which was likely for the best. Miss Belrose. I turned. He stood squarely before me, storm wind tugging at the dark braid tied back from his collar. There was ash-silver static dusted over one sleeve. A cut I had not noticed before marked the back of his right hand where some brace had caught him. "You are not merely a workshop artisan," he said. No one on deck spoke. Even Felix had the sense to shut his mouth. I had spent my entire life being exactly that. The phrase should have pleased me. Instead it hit somewhere stranger. "I still am," I said. Marcus's expression did not shift. "Yes, a beat, and more than that." It was the closest thing to praise I suspected he had given anyone in weeks. He turned at once to the helm crew. "Log the storm encounter. Revised approach to Glassmere. Notify all hands. First fault confirmed active and not isolated." The deck moved again with purpose. Julian exhaled slowly beside me, as if only now allowing the storm's grip on his own body to loosen. I looked at him in time to see him put one hand to the rail very lightly, steadying himself with a control so practiced it hurt to witness. "You should sit down," I said. He looked at me, and absurdly, despite the pallor and the strain, there was laughter in his eyes. That sounded uncomfortably like an order. "Then obey it before I grow ambitious." "I shall consider it. You should also drink water." Was that the workshop training or natural tyranny? Both. That drew the smile I had wanted and not meant to want. Felix leaned over the lamp housing again, glaring at the rewound silver as if it had insulted his education. "This is not random," he said. "The crossing altered the conductor behavior. Not just physically. It changed how the current distributed under route bite." He looked up at me, wild with half-formed conclusions. "The way you tied that, did you decide the turn angles in the moment?" "Yes." "Based on?" "Feel." He shut his eyes briefly as if struck by both delight and personal injury. "Of course," Marcus said, "if feel keeps the ship in the sky, you may write it into your notes." I refused to phrase it so inelegantly. "Then do not publish." I stared at them both. Somehow I had ended up in a storm with a severe captain and a scholar who behaved as if danger were a footnote trying to become a theory, and this was my life now. A deck lieutenant approached at speed and saluted Marcus. "Captain." Signal from aft watch. Possible shadowing craft 2 route lines south, no flag visible. Marcus's whole body changed without moving much. Alert narrowed him. "Merchant." Too far yet to confirm. "Holding distance." Marcus's gaze flicked once toward the route line behind us, then toward Julian. It was a brief look. Still I saw the calculation in it. Julian saw it too. "Continue watch." The lieutenant bowed and moved off. I followed the direction of Marcus's glance but saw only bright distance and the faint silver braid of the dayline. No ship visible from where I stood. Felix was still staring down the western sky. "Could be nothing," Marcus said, "then it will remain nothing until identified." It was an ordinary enough answer. Yet the cold small prickle at the back of my neck returned, the one I had felt in the palace when Oren's eyes rested too long on the crown and the route maps. The minister had said he believed in patterns. Powerful men who believed in patterns rarely allowed unknown pieces to travel unwatched. A shadowing craft. No flag. Perhaps it was only another route vessel. Perhaps not. The Lumina flew on. By the time the first western junction towers rose clearer from the horizon, the storm edge had fallen behind us, but the mood on deck had not softened. Crew kept glancing at the rewound prow housing. Felix had begun sketching the crossing pattern from memory before I could stop him. Marcus doubled the forward watch. Julian finally let one of the attendants press a flask of mineral water into his hand, though only after I stared at him long enough to make refusal awkward. The capital had shrunk to a pale gleam behind us now. Ahead lay Glassmere, and beyond that the deeper western chain where the first reports had already turned obsolete in less than a night. I stood at the observation rail with the dismantled flower ring still looped around my wrist like the remains of a promise I had not meant to make. Below, the morning sun struck the trade routes in fractured light. Above, the sky looked clear enough to trust until you knew where to look. And somewhere behind us, out past the line where distance swallowed detail, something without a flag was keeping to our wake. Chapter 4. The isle where the wind had stopped. Glassmere smelled wrong before we even docked. Trade islands always smelled of movement. Rope tar, dried fruit, polished hullwood, spiced tea crates, fish salt, hot metal from lift gears, lamp oil, sweat, and the sharp cold seam where open sky cut through it all. Even when crowded, even when dirty, they smelled alive. Goods came in, goods went out, and the air kept score. Glassmere smelled like things that had waited too long. The first breath of it reached the Lumina before the island filled the view. Sour sweetness from split fruit casks. Damp grain. Wet canvas left shut too long. A bitter rot that sat under everything else and made the back of my tongue prickle. Standing at the forward rail, I could almost map the delays by scent alone. Felix grimaced beside me. That's produce spoilage. Among other cheerful realities, I said. Marcus, who missed very little and ignored even less, had already ordered the outer masks brought up for the lower docking teams. He did not bother offering the gesture any drama. The island was in trouble. Lungs were practical matters. Glassmere itself floated broad and low compared with the higher court islands near the capital. Its center was built around a ring of warehouse roofs and counting halls, all fitted in pale bronze tile meant to flash welcome to incoming trade vessels. Around that spread merchant rows, cooper yards, docking cranes, drying towers, inns, packing houses, and the long spill of temporary freight sheds erected whenever the fruit season peaked. The western edge dropped into terraced cargo platforms bristling with loading arms. Usually such places had a harsh kind of grace, every pulley and gantry existing because something else depended on it. Today the grace was buried under strain. Ships lined the outer berths 3 deep, some still waiting for unloading windows, others sitting half-worked because the next route segment would not hold stable enough to send them on. The sky over the main approach should have held the faint clean geometry of active guidance lines even in daylight. Instead the air there looked smudged, the invisible structure underneath failing often enough to show itself in brief pale stutters. Route masts that should have stood steady flickered at uneven intervals. One berth arm had been lashed shut entirely, the entry light over it dead. And the people on the docks moved with the stiff fast temper of those who had run out of patience yesterday and had been forced to keep going. They've been holding cargo in the open, I said. Julian stood on my other side, one hand resting lightly on the rail. You can tell? I nodded toward the northern platform where a row of produce crates sat under stretched tarpaulins weighted with chain. That fruit should already be in cool storage or shipped onward. If it's still there, they ran out of bay space. If they ran out of bay space, other shipments weren't moving. Felix peered where I pointed. And if other shipments weren't moving, newer ones had nowhere to go. Which means counting delays, spoilage disputes, dock fights, and every merchant blaming a different office, I said. Marcus glanced over. You have worked a trade yard before. Not officially. We all work one if we buy materials at the harbor enough. The Lumina slowed on its approach, light sails trimming to a taut pearl curve above us. The prow lamp, now held by my improvised silver bind, burned clean and steady, but I could not look at it without remembering white petals blowing off the observation deck like torn snow. The remains of the crown ring sat wrapped in cloth inside my satchel. I had not decided whether that made it salvage or memorial. Below, dock officers were already running to clear space. At least 2 harbor clerks had turned from their arguments to gape upward. The royal crest on the Lumina's prow tended to stop smaller dramas in mid-breath, if only because people wanted time to guess what larger one had arrived. Julian's expression had gone still in a way I was learning to read. Not cold, focused. The same look he had worn at the harbor when the platform broke, only quieter now, with less chaos to push against. There were shadows under his eyes still, the sort no amount of rank erased, but he stood straighter than he had after the storm edge. Perhaps distance from the fault line had eased the strain in his body. Perhaps he was simply refusing to show weakness before an island already on edge. Marcus turned from the helm crew. We dock at Central Trade Berth 4. Minimal ceremonial presence. Your Highness, I recommend inspection from the upper route office first. Julian said we begin at the spoilage yards. Marcus's jaw tightened by a degree. The route office will not enjoy that. Then they are welcome to improve their morning with useful work. Felix looked down to hide a smile. I looked at Julian. He had said it in the same calm voice he used for most things. No flourish, no pointed noble righteousness. That somehow made the answer hit harder. I had expected the royal visit to start in a clean chamber somewhere above the stench, with reports and polished concern and perhaps a formal promise that everything unfortunate would be considered by someone higher than the people already losing coin and temper on the docks. Instead, he meant to walk into the worst of it first. The Lumina's hull settled into berth with a smooth shudder through the deck. Dock clamps rose to meet the side locks. Crew lines flew. Voices answered from below, raw from overuse. The moment the gangway started to lower, the noise of Glassmere came up whole. Not the cheerful grind of trade. A tighter sound. Men arguing over damaged goods. Someone shouting for a tally scribe. The splinter crack of a crate dropped badly. The cough of a laborer who had spent too long breathing mold-spiked air. Distant gullbirds wheeling above the fish yards and crying over scraps. Winches grinding under too much stop-start correction. And beneath it all the restless murmur of a place where too many shipments had become too many problems. A receiving delegation waited at the end of the gangway because royal ships do not arrive without pulling titles from holes in the ground. The lead official, a heavy-set man in route office dark blue with silver braid dampened dark at the collar by sweat, had assembled himself into the expression of someone deeply honored to be miserable in person. He bowed low when Julian descended. Your Highness. Had we known the Lumina would attend us directly, the proper reception, Julian stepped onto the dock before the sentence finished. Then you might have spent this hour on flowers instead of freight. The official blinked. I felt a dangerous, traitorous pleasure warm my chest. Your name, Julian said. Deputy Superintendent Callies, Your Highness. Of the Glassmere Route Bureau. Deputy Superintendent, Julian said, turning his gaze past the man to the stacked tarps, the backed-up loading lanes, the arguing handlers. Show me the worst berth first. Callies looked as if this had not been the answer he meant to give. The western spoilage bay is being assessed, but if Your Highness would care to refresh yourself in the office while we prepare a summary, no. Not loud. Final. Around us the dock noise did not stop, but its edges shifted. Workers nearby had begun to notice. Royal visits to trade islands generally stayed clean. A prince on a stained dock with rotting freight behind him did not fit the usual order of the day. Marcus came down the gangway after us with 2 guards and the hard practical silence of a man counting exits, hazards, and possible attack angles in one sweep. Felix followed with charts under one arm, already peering toward the nearest route mast as if he wanted to climb it and insult its condition personally. I stepped onto the dock last and the island met me in layers. Heat rising off damp boards, the smell of souring produce, rope fibers under my boots, shouted numbers from a tally rail, and the look people gave when they noticed the prince and then noticed me beside him and could not place what I was doing there. Some took me for a minor attendant at first glance. That assumption usually died at my tool satchel and sturdier boots. The second guess was servant. The third, If they saw Marcus watching the area around me with unwilling inclusion, tended to become confusion. I preferred confusion to the truth just then. The truth was harder to explain. We moved through the central berth with guards only at the edges. Julian had insisted on minimal display and gotten as close to it as palace custom allowed. Even so, his presence spread ahead of us in widening recognition. Dock hands straightened. Merchants stopped mid-argument. A child perched on a barrel almost dropped the plum she was eating when her mother dragged her into a bow. None of it altered Julian's pace. The western spoilage yard was worse than the dock front. Canvas sheets stretched over stacked crates in long, low rows, but too many had sagged under damp or been opened and reclosed so often the seals hung shredded. The first cask I passed had split a seam and leaked fermented pear mash onto the boards, where flies worried at it in a lazy drunken cloud. A stack of cooling stones lay unused beside a store bay because the bay itself was full. Men in work aprons stood over ledgers arguing with merchant agents who smelled of money and panic. One of the laborers saw the royal party, looked ready to bow, then thought better of it and blurted about time. The yard went still around him. Callies inhaled in horror. Marcus's attention snapped like a hooked blade toward the speaker. The man himself looked as if only after speaking had he remembered his own mouth belonged to him and could ruin things without filing paperwork. Julian did not let anyone else touch the moment. "What is your name?" he asked. The laborer swallowed. "Darren, Your Highness." "How long have these shipments waited, Darren?" The man blinked. "Longest? 4 days." That drew a hiss from somewhere behind me. 4 days on perishables in high summer sky air was not delay. It was slow murder. Julian walked straight to the nearest compromised stack, not minding that the boards were sticky underfoot. He crouched beside a crate half open to reveal a layer of spotted moonbeers gone soft at the stems. Fruit for wealthy tables in their final hours. Why weren't these rerouted to cool storage? He asked. Darren looked at Callies, then back at the prince, choosing honesty with the reckless gratitude of a man who had not been offered it often enough. Because the upper warehouse line stalled when berth 2 lost route catch and the clerks kept holding space for westbound tea shipments that never cleared. Then Bay 7 flooded from roof seam damage and the reserve stones got shifted to preserve medicine casks instead. Julian touched one of the crate tags, reading the shipment marks. And how much produce was left exposed while the clerks argued? "Too much, Your Highness." Answer with numbers. That came not sharp enough to shame, but precise enough to demand worth. Darren licked his lips. "Yesterday by dusk, 26 fruit stacks, 12 herb bundles, 6 resin casks gone sticky from heat, 3 flour crates we had to break early and salvage by hand." My head turned. "Flowers from where?" Darren looked surprised that I had asked. "South Chain growers. Mid-grade star lilies mostly. 2 moonvine packets. Some bellroot blooms already wilted. No wonder our last Western material lot had come in half usable." Julian rose. He did not turn to Callies at once. He looked farther into the yard, toward the men trying to sort spoiled from salvageable, toward the women at the tally line fighting to recalculate losses while more carts rolled in because the island had nowhere else to put them. "This is not a paperwork delay," he said. Callies swallowed. "No, Your Highness. It is an island-level failure." Callies tried to straighten into dignity and almost managed it. The anomalies increased beyond the Bureau's projected range. Marcus gave a very quiet sound that could have meant anything from contempt to acknowledgement. Julian stepped toward the next stack, where a torn tarpaulin had exposed crates of dried citrus. He picked up one of the ledgers from a nearby barrel and turned pages with quick, efficient hands. I watched his face change as he read, not in great visible expressions, but in small tightenings around the mouth and eyes. He understood what the entries meant. That mattered more to me than if he had delivered a speech. "You marked these as weather loss," he said. Callies went pale. Interim classification, Your Highness. These were not weather loss. No, Your Highness. Then someone preferred false neatness in the books to immediate redistribution. The deputy superintendent did not answer. Julian handed the ledger back to the tally woman whose fingers still bore juice stains from split fruit. What is your name? Mara, Your Highness. Mara, if you were given full authority over this yard for one day, what would you do first? Her eyes went wide. So did half the yards. I almost smiled despite the smell. She looked once to Callie's, realized perhaps that the usual fear might be temporarily suspended by the presence of a prince who had asked a real question, and said, clear basics for medicine and cold hold fruit only. Strip all stall tea claims till the route actually opens. Break the spoiled stacks now before rot gets into the salvage rows. Send the herbalists to sort what can still dry. And get the route clerks off the counting stools and onto the wet boards, so maybe next time they'll stop holding signatures while goods die. Felix let out a breath that might have been admiration. Julian said, do it. Callie's made a distressed movement. Your Highness, procedures require, then revise your mourning around them. No one in the yard moved for one heartbeat. Then Mara barked, you heard him. Basics. Now. And suddenly the place woke in a different direction. Laborers who had spent hours trapped under bad office decisions took the prince's order like a dropped knife. Men ran for pry bars. 2 women at the salvage line rolled sleeves at once and started shouting sorting marks. Someone laughed once, harsh and delighted, at the sight of clerks being told to shift crates with their own hands. I stood in the middle of it with the stink of rot and damp rope in my nose and realized something inside me had eased. Not because a prince had fixed the island. He had not. Not in minutes. Not with one order and a few honest questions. But he had stepped onto a filthy dock, gone straight for the worst bay, and asked the people doing the work what was actually failing. No performance. No distance polished into sympathy. He had put his hands on the spoiled ledger and seen the lie in it. Respect changed shape in me then. It stopped being dazzled and became heavier, more dangerous. We spent the next hour crossing the western trade quarter in widening circles of damage. At the herb drying racks, bundles hung too damp because outbound wind couriers had missed their collection windows. At the resin store, one merchant nearly wept explaining how repeated stop-start route holds had changed chamber temperatures enough to cloud a batch meant for palace perfumers. Near the fish sheds, women with hooked knives and hard eyes showed Marcus the cold chain delays on the north berth and told him exactly how many barrels had been lost because the route lights over the auxiliary lane flickered out at dusk. He listened without interruption and only once asked for repetition. Julian moved through all of it like a man bred for court and stubborn enough to refuse living only there. He did not rush people into shorter versions of pain. He asked for times, numbers, names, sequences. Which berth failed first, which route marker dimmed, which clerks held cargo, which lines still held after sundown, whether the light distortion worsened at a tide of air or at random. He wanted the shape of the thing, not the theater of concern around it. And every time I watched him choose the harder question instead of the cleaner one, the memory of the ballroom I had not yet seen but already feared in my imagination loosened its grip. He might belong to a world of white stone and ancient rites, but he did not walk through this one as if it existed to flatter him. At one packing shed, a crate shifted badly while 2 men tried to stack around a warped support. Before I had even drawn breath, Julian was there with them, catching the corner and bearing weight long enough for Marcus to bark correction and the men to reset the load. The crew lieutenant nearest us started forward too late. The prince stepped back with dust on one sleeve and did not seem to think the motion worth remark. The dock workers did. No one cheered. This was not that sort of island and they were too angry for performative gratitude. But I felt the change in the yard like a wind shift. Faces that had been guarded turned attentive. Backs straighten not from fear of rank, but because attention, once given honestly, invites something perilously close to hope. Hope, on trade islands, is often followed by demands. Good, I thought. Marcus at last managed to pull Julian briefly aside near a collapsed loading gantry while Felix climbed the base of a route mast with two local lampmen and offended all three by explaining what they should already have checked. I had lingered near a stack of dried leaves, trying not to breathe too deeply through a bloom-rot patch, when I heard Marcus say, low and clipped, "You are not required to touch every broken crate yourself." Julian replied, "No. Only the ones no one else is allowed to move until someone important sees them." Marcus's expression, always severe, became more so. "The island will not improve faster because you overextend." Julian's voice softened without yielding. "And it will not improve at all if all I do here is accept reports in clean gloves." I looked away then because the conversation felt too private to watch openly, though Marcus had probably counted my position long before. Still, the words stayed with me. Felix returned not long after, hair more disordered than before and satisfaction bright in his face. "The route mast is unstable at the lower catch ring," he said, dropping from the ladder with no respect for his own bones. "Not enough to collapse, enough to flicker under strain." More interestingly, the old support brackets beneath the current housing show signs of earlier reworking. "Different hands, different metal age," Marcus said. "Sabotage?" Felix grimaced. "Too soon to say. Poor maintenance in the last decade, certainly. Possibly older structural interference under that." Julian turned to me. "You said on the ship that some binds change how current moves. Would you look?" Tallies, still sweating through his dignity nearby, opened his mouth as if to object that dock fittings were not for artisans to inspect on instinct. Julian did not even glance at him. That spared us all a longer conversation. I walked to the route mast because by now refusing would have been foolish pride and because a part of me wanted to see whether the strange knowing in my fingers survived landfall. The mast stood at the edge of the berth lane, a tall silver-gray column braced into the dock by three support arms and ringed at chest height with a service housing of star glass and metal. Daylight made its active line faint, but the structure itself carried a low restless vibration against the boards. One lampman had already opened the lower panel. Inside, three conductor lines fed upward into the route crystal through a newer mesh of office-approved stabilizing braces. And beneath those, barely visible in the dark of the lower housing, ran something older. "Hold the lantern lower," I said. The lampman obeyed before realizing whom he was obeying. The extra light struck the lower bracket and I saw it clearly. A pattern scored into the old metal under the newer bind. Not decoration. Repeated crossings cut with too much intention to be casual marks. Diamond turns with a narrow underhook at each corner meant to catch the line in hidden tension. My breath caught. I had seen that shape before. Not on masts, never on official route gear. On paper scraps in my mother's work basket when I was small. On the inside band of an old ceremonial circlet master Lara once bought half broken from an estate lot because the silver was still worth melting. On the edge of my own thoughts when my fingers moved too quickly and old patterns came easier than modern ones. "The crossing underhook. What is it?" Julian asked. I reached toward the scored metal and stopped before touching. "This older brace pattern, I know it." Felix leaned so close I wanted to elbow him. "From where?" "My mother's work," I said. The words landed harder than I expected. Because saying them aloud over an official route mast made the connection real in a way private wondering had not. Tallies frowned. "That is impossible. These lower brackets are ancient infrastructure." Felix said, "Yes. That is the exciting part." Marcus muttered, "For you?" I ignored both of them. The old scoring ran beneath the newer office mesh in a way that suggested the current binders had either never noticed it or chosen to treat it as irrelevant support ornament. But the newer brace had been fixed badly over it, flattening some of the underhooks and forcing current into harsher direct angles. No wonder the mast caught and lost its line under strain. I pointed. These modern braces are choking whatever the slower pattern was meant to do. One of the lampmen looked offended on behalf of authorized procedures. Those braces are regulation standard. Yes, I said, and the regulation is wrong for this housing. He opened his mouth, then looked at the faint active shiver in the lamp crystal and closed it again. Julian asked, "Can you correct it?" "Not fully. Not here. Not without opening the whole lower ring and probably taking the mast offline for a while." Hallie's nearly stopped breathing. "Absolutely not. We cannot lose another active berth marker." "Then enjoy the flicker," I said. Felix made a small noise of approval that I did not need in my life. Julian crouched beside the housing, studying the old scored pattern. "Could it be one of the route signatures you mentioned from early structural language?" Felix's expression sharpened. "Possibly. Or a precursor form. If paired with one of the older station nodes," Marcus cut in. "In plain speech." Felix drew a breath like a scholar insulted by necessity. "The old brace may have been designed to distribute route current more gently, the way Miss Belrose's silver bind did on the Lumina. The newer office mesh forces the current straight through the most stable channel, which works in healthy lines but overstrains in damaged ones." Marcus looked at the housing, then at me. "So her crown knot and your storm repair were not accidents." I did not answer quickly because the word accident had become slippery around me. "I made choices," I said. "Whether I understood all of them at the time is another matter." Marcus gave one slow nod. He was, I thought, learning to trust me precisely because I refused the easier grandness. By noon the western quarter of Glassmere had transformed from stalled resentment into organized anger, which was healthier and much louder. Bay 6 had been cleared. Spoilage rows were being broken and sorted. Clerks stood ankle-deep in fruit water and looked as though they now regretted every quiet desk they had ever defended. Mara had somehow taken half the yard into effective command by the simple act of already knowing what needed doing. If she ever chose mutiny, several docks would likely follow. Julian had yet to retreat into office shade. When Callie's finally managed to press for a formal report session, the prince agreed only on the condition that it happen in the warehouse counting hall overlooking the active yards, not in the sealed bureau room above. "If I am to hear how this was allowed," he said, "I prefer the smell to remain honest." Callie's looked briefly as though the island might swallow him and spare us further discussion. The counting hall was open-sided and far less grand than the name suggested, a long raised platform with slate boards, abacus rails, tally tables, and a line of high windows on the west facing the outer cliffs. From there we could see ships still waiting off the auxiliary route, their sails furled in frustration. The damp stink from the spoilage yard came through every beam crack. "Good." Callie's assembled his clerks, lamp supervisors, and 2 regional trade factors who wanted desperately to sound more dignified than their ledgers allowed. Felix spread charts over one table and began cross-marking route faults with the fury of a man who considered ignorance a personal enemy. Marcus stationed guards at the entry and then prowled the perimeter like a storm-given boots. I took a place near the window because I preferred air and because no one had assigned me a seat. That itself said plenty. I was needed, not placed. Useful, not categorized. Dangerous ground, socially speaking. The reports confirmed what the yards had already told us. The route instability had first appeared as intermittent drift 3 weeks prior on secondary western lanes, mild enough that the Bureau logged it as seasonal variance. Then one of the relay beacons near the western spur began losing catch after midnight. Then berth 2 in Glassmere flickered, recovered, and flickered again. Clerks had compensated by holding cargo on the assumption the line would stabilize within standard expectation. Standard expectation had then failed spectacularly. Why was the western spur not inspected at first escalation? Julian asked. One clerk began, because decommissioned support nodes are not prioritized under current office, not under current office laziness, Felix muttered without looking up. The clerk glared. Julian did not rebuke the scholar. Callies answered instead, stiff with the effort of defending a broken system before the heir to the throne. Because the decommissioned spur leads toward an obsolete station line that has held no strategic value in generations. Julian's gaze sharpened. Held none. Or was treated as if it held none? Callies hesitated one fraction too long. Felix's head lifted. There it is. Marcus said, explain. Callies looked cornered and knew it. There had been old rumors attached to the outer station line. Residual lights. False catch readings. Workers refusing maintenance after dark. The Bureau chose to classify the line as unreliable rather than continue dedicating men and materials to structures with no current route significance. I turned from the window. You ignored a repeating anomaly because it was inconvenient. We deprioritized an obsolete hazard, Callies snapped, then seemed to remember he was addressing not a dock girl but someone standing inside a royal inquiry. Julian's tone stayed calm enough to freeze water. And now the obsolete hazard appears linked to a trade island route collapse. Silence answered him. I looked back toward the western windows. Beyond the counting hall, past the outer freight shelves and the lower cliff road, the island narrowed into a less developed edge where old stone foundations still clung above the drop. If an obsolete station line lay out there, it would be on the island margins where trade had grown over older bones and then forgotten them. Something pulled at me then. Not strong. Not like the flare in the harbor. A whisper under my ribs as if a thread had been laid lightly against skin. I frowned. The feeling faded. I stayed very still, waiting. Nothing. Perhaps I was only tired. Or half mad now, which was also possible. The formal report dragged on, as formal reports do when the truth beneath them is uglier than any participant wants on paper. By the end, we had a probable pattern. Glassmere's active masts were failing under compounded strain because the Western route network was no longer distributing current cleanly. Something farther out was distorting the line. Something old enough that the office had long since stopped thinking of it as active and recent enough that the faults now spread inward instead of remaining night shift rumors for maintenance crews. Then we go to the spur, Julian said. Callies looked appalled. Your Highness, the outer cliff path is unstable and the station ruin itself is sealed. Felix brightened instantly. Then we absolutely go to the spur. Marcus said we go with 6 guards, 2 lampmen, lined gear, and no one wandering off cliffs in pursuit of academic ecstasy. I feel targeted, Felix said. You are. I looked again to the west edge of the island and felt that strange thin pull a second time. Not from the hall, from farther out. My fingers tightened on the window frame. Julian noticed at once. What is it? I do not know. I hated how vague that sounded. Something moved. Felix was at my side in 2 breaths. What sort of moved? I am not a route chart, Felix. No, much more interesting. Marcus sighed through his nose. I closed my eyes, trying to catch it again. Smell first, salt-cold air from the outer cliffs, the damp sweetness of spoiled fruit behind us, dust from old stone in the rafters. Sound, clerks shifting slates, distant yard shouting, gulls. Under that nothing definite. Yet the sense remained. A prickle toward the island's far western edge. I opened my eyes and pointed. Out there. Felix followed the line of my hand to the cliff road. The obsolete station quarter. Callies said quickly, it has not been active in living memory. Then it has had excellent time to become inconvenient, Felix replied. Julian was already moving. Marcus. The captain did not waste effort objecting now that the decision had been made. We leave in 5 minutes. The outer road cut past Glassmere's useful face into its neglected one. Trade islands always have edges where function thins and memory thickens. Workshops give way to old retaining walls. Counting yards become storage ruins. Decorative public stone stops being maintained because merchants prefer visible profit to picturesque ancestry. Glassmere's western road led through exactly such a thinning. The noise of the main berths fell away behind us as we passed shuttered rope sheds, an abandoned cooling house whose window arches had cracked under old frost stress, and a row of waystones half swallowed by wind-blown grit. The sky opened wider there. No freight cranes blocked it. The drop beyond the cliff edge flashed hard blue under the afternoon sun. Wind came cleaner, sharper, carrying less rot and more mineral cold from lower air currents. We walked in a loose file, Marcus and 2 guards forward, Felix unable to decide whether to keep pace or race ahead, Julian beside me, the lampman behind with gear packs and line hooks. Tallis had tried to excuse himself on administrative grounds and had been denied with such mild royal courtesy that I almost pitied him. "You felt something from here?" Julian asked once the road narrowed. "Yes. Like the flare in the harbor?" "No." I searched for words and disliked all of them. "Smaller." Not as if it recognized him, I added, meaning the crown in his hand then, or me exactly. "More like a tug," Felix said from just ahead, a residual call. Marcus said, a useful description for people who enjoy dying of imprecision. Felix flung a hand, then a low-grade directional resonance. "Worse," Marcus said. I laughed before I could stop myself. Julian glanced sideways at me, and there was that warmth again, quiet and impossible not to feel. The road turned between 2 broken starstone pillars and the old station came into view. It was not grand anymore. That struck me first. I had expected something vast if the office spoke of it in tones of sealed irrelevance and if old route lines once converged there. Instead, the structure crouched against the cliff in half-buried dignity, as if the island had grown away from it. A circular stone platform jutted from the edge, its outer ring cracked in 3 places and webbed with lichen gray mineral stains. Behind it rose a low domed chamber with part of its roof fallen in. Old metal bands, greened by time, wrapped the doorway arch. The path leading up had been blocked once by an official seal gate, but the gate now hung twisted from one hinge. Not broken by age. Forced. Marcus saw it too. "No one touches anything." One of the guards moved ahead to check the ground. Another circled toward the cliff side. The lampmen set down their packs with the nervous care of men who had spent years calling a place cursed and were now discovering curses often turned out to have very practical footprints. I climbed the last rise slowly. The tug in my chest strengthened with each step. Then my satchel strap slipped and the wrapped crown ring inside knocked lightly against my hip. Something on the platform answered. It was not visible at first. A faint silver shimmer ran through one of the cracks in the old stone ring and vanished so fast I thought I had imagined it. "I saw that," Julian said quietly. "So I had not imagined it." Felix almost ran. Marcus caught his shoulder before he reached the platform edge. "Control yourself." It lit. "Yes. That is the important part." Marcus did not release him immediately. Wise man. I walked onto the platform because by now the strange things seemed to prefer happening within arm's reach of me. Old stone held the heat of the afternoon sun under my boots, but beneath that warmth lay another feel entirely, a coolness like metal in shade, not on the surface but threaded through the structure. The outer ring bore carved bands nearly worn smooth by time. I crouched and brushed grit from one section with my glove. My breath caught. The pattern underneath was the same underhook crossing I had seen in the route mast housing. Not identical in scale, related in hand. The lines curved into star petal forms at the corners, half geometric, half floral, as if whoever made them had thought structure and ornament were not enemies. Wind-driven grit had filled most of the grooves. Some had been scratched over more recently. "No," I murmured. Julian crouched beside me. "What?" I pointed to the fresher scoring. Someone was here before us. Marcus came closer at once. The captain did not crouch so much as fold into readiness. Recent? Not today. But not ancient. I touched the shallow gouges near one carved band. See the scrape angle. Metal tools, not weather. And this, near the base of the collapsed dome wall, one of the stone seams had been chipped open, then clumsily packed back with filler resin now gone brittle. Not official work. Too rough. Too hidden. Someone had tried to pry into the station's lower structure and then disguise the attempt badly. Felix went very still, which on him was more alarming than excitement. That's no maintenance seam. Hallie's, arriving breathless and unhappy, stared at the damage. We were told the site was sealed. Marcus turned his head slightly. You were told many things. The wind shifted. From inside the ruined dome came a faint tone, almost too low to hear. Not sound exactly. More the suggestion of a note through old metal. It stirred the fine hair along my wrists. Then the wrapped crown ring in my satchel pulsed once against my side. I stood up so fast I nearly lost balance. The others saw my expression before I spoke. It's here, I said. Felix's eyes lit with scholarly indecency. What is? I don't know, I snapped. But it's here. Julian rose with me. Can you follow it? The honest answer was terrifying. Yes. Marcus swore softly enough to count as professionalism. The old dome chamber yawned ahead, half-shadowed, broken open to the sky through a crack in the roof. Beyond its threshold, the floor sloped inward into dark. The platform under my feet gave a faint silver shimmer again, stronger this time, running along the old carved underhooks before sinking into the stone as if something deeper had heard us arrive and turned in its sleep. Felix whispered, it glowed here last night. I looked at him sharply. What? One of the lampmen, pale beneath his windburn, spoke before Felix could. My sister's husband works the outer freight shelf, he said. He said the station rang through a light near midnight. Just once. Everyone thought it was storm reflection. No one in the route office had thought to include that in the morning summaries. Or had chosen not to. Julian's gaze moved from the lit crack in the platform to the forced seal gate, then to me. The wind off the cliff lifted the loose hair at his temple. There was strain in him still, but beneath it now something steadier, clearer, the same resolve I had seen in the spoilage yard when he stepped into rot and numbers instead of taking comfort in polished reports. We go in, he said. My pulse kicked hard. Not from fear alone. From the certainty that the old path under the island had just reached back for us. I looked once more at the carved ring under my boots, at the familiar hidden crossings buried in state stone, at the scrape marks proving other hands had come here first, and at the dark mouth of the ruined station where something quiet and waiting had begun to answer my broken crown. Then I tightened my grip on the satchel strap and stepped toward the doorway.